Jane Pauley, welcome to Healthy Kidneys After 60, a space where we slow down to listen to the quiet signals our bodies send us as we journey through our golden years. I am your host, Jane Pauley, and today we are addressing a fear that keeps many of us awake at night, the unpredictability of our own health, specifically that sudden, unexplained rise in blood pressure that seems to strike out of nowhere. Joining us is a man who has spent nearly 5 decades listening to the hearts and minds of over 20,000 patients, the esteemed Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Sanjay, it is an absolute privilege to have you here to help us navigate these uncertain waters with the wisdom of your experience. Sanjay Gupta, it is a profound honor to be here with you, Jane, and with everyone listening at home. Over the years, I have realized that medicine is not just about charts and prescriptions. It is about the stories of people who are trying to live their best lives while facing the natural changes of aging. I can feel the quiet anxiety that often accompanies a doctor's visit, and today I want to strip away the clinical coldness. I want to speak to you not just as a physician, but as someone who deeply respects the resilience of the human body, especially as we cross the threshold of 60, 70, and beyond. Jane Pauley, Sanjay, I want to start with a scenario that I think will resonate deeply with so many people watching or listening right now, because it is a story I hear constantly from friends and viewers in their 70s. Imagine a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The sun is setting, you are sitting in your favorite armchair with a book, or perhaps just watching the news, completely at peace, or so you think. Suddenly, there is this strange, heavy thumping in your chest, a slight warmth creeping up your neck, and a sense of unease that you cannot name. You reach for your blood pressure cuff, and the numbers on the screen are shocking, 160, 170, despite the fact that you have been sitting perfectly still for an hour. There is this terrifying feeling that your body is suddenly a stranger, or worse, that it is betraying you without any provocation at all. Is this just the inevitable tax we pay for growing older, an unavoidable instability of the heart, or is there something much more subtle happening beneath the surface that we are all missing? Sanjay Gupta, that image you painted, Jane, of sitting in a quiet room and feeling that sudden spike of internal pressure is perhaps one of the most common and distressing experiences my patients share with me. It creates a specific kind of psychological trauma because it feels like an invisible enemy is attacking you while you are most vulnerable. But I want to tell everyone listening something very important. Your body is not a machine that simply breaks down because the calendar turns a page. What we are seeing in those moments isn't necessarily a failure of the heart itself, but rather a very complex, very rapid communication breakdown between different parts of your system. For decades, we have been conditioned to believe that blood pressure is solely a heart problem or a kidney problem, and while those organs are central players, they are often just responding to signals coming from the periphery of our bodies. When you are sitting in that chair and the numbers climb, your heart is often reacting to a state of tension that has been building up in places you would never think to check. Jane Pauley, it is so fascinating that you mentioned the periphery because we usually focus so intensely on the chest or the head when we feel that surge of pressure. Most of us have spent our lives thinking of the heart as this isolated pump, and when it acts up, we feel helpless, like we are victims of our own biology. You've mentioned before that there is a secret switch or a hidden regulator for this pressure that isn't located in the chest at all, but rather in our extremities, specifically our hands. For someone sitting at home, perhaps feeling their fingers stiffen or their grip tighten as they worry about their health, how is it possible that something as small as our hands could hold the key to calming a heart that feels like it's racing out of control? Is it really possible that the solution to such a heavy internal problem could be hiding in plain sight right at the ends of our arms? Sanjay Gupta, it sounds almost too simple to be true, doesn't it? But the science of the human body is often most elegant in its simplicity. Our hands are one of the most densely packed areas of the body when it comes to nerve endings and small blood vessels called capillaries. Think of your hands not just as tools for gripping, but as a massive communication hub for your nervous system. There is a direct, lightning-fast highway between the tension in your fingers and the centers in your brain that control your fight or flight response. When we are stressed, or even when we are just aging and our vessels become a bit less elastic, we tend to carry a hidden tension in our hands. We clench them without knowing it. We hold them stiffly. This sends a signal to the brain that the body is under duress, which in turn tells the heart to pump harder and the vessels to constrict. In my 50 years of practice, I have seen that by consciously addressing the state of the hands, we can actually trick the nervous system into a state of profound relaxation. We are essentially using the hands as a remote control for the heart. This isn't just a theory, it is rooted in how our sympathetic nervous system reacts to physical stimulus. When you understand that your hands can either be a source of tension or a source of release, you regain a sense of mastery over your own health that you thought was lost. We aren't just aging, we are adapting. And learning how to use these switches in our hands is one of the most powerful tools a person over 60 can possess. Jane Pauley, Sanjay, I've spent a lot of time talking to people in their 70s who feel like they are living in a state of constant, quiet surveillance of their own bodies. And the word that comes up most often is betrayal. They tell me they have followed all the rules, they have eaten the bland meals, they have taken the walks, and yet they wake up to a blood pressure reading that feels like a slap in the face. It's that haunting inconsistency where one day everything is perfect and the next day the numbers are soaring for no reason at all, leaving them feeling like their body is no longer a home they can trust, but a temperamental machine that could fail at any moment. When a person reaches that point of frustration where they feel like no matter what they do, their health is slipping through their fingers like sand, how do you, as a physician who has seen this thousands of times, begin to bridge that gap between their clinical reality and the deep emotional toll of feeling like their own biology has turned against them? Sanjay Gupta. You know, Jane, that feeling of betrayal is something I remember so vividly when I first met Margaret Wilson, a 72-year-old lady living in a beautiful sun-drenched home in San Diego, California. Margaret was the epitome of health conscious. She was someone who knew her numbers better than she knew her own grandchildren's birthdays, and she came to me with tears in her eyes because her blood pressure was behaving like a wild animal. She would be sitting in her garden smelling the jasmine, and suddenly her systolic would jump to 165, and she told me she felt like her body was a traitor because she hadn't eaten a gram of salt or had a single stressful thought. I had to sit her down and explain that what she perceived as betrayal was actually her body trying to speak to her in a language she hadn't learned yet, because our bodies don't just break down randomly after 60. Instead, they become hypersensitive, like a finely tuned instrument that reacts to the slightest vibration. And in Margaret's case, she was so focused on her heart that she didn't realize her entire nervous system was in a state of high alert. I told her that day that we weren't going to fight her body anymore, but rather listen to the subtle signals it was sending through the periphery, because once you stop viewing your body as an enemy, the tension that drives those spikes begins to dissolve. Jane Pauley. It's so powerful to hear about someone like Margaret because her story is the story of millions, and it brings up this fundamental question about the hidden signals we ignore while we are staring at the digital screen of a blood pressure monitor. We are taught to look at the result, the final number, but we rarely talk about the silent journey the body takes to get there, especially those physiological whispers that happen long before the alarm goes off. If we aren't supposed to see this as a betrayal or a mechanical failure, then what is the deeper conversation our nervous system is trying to have with us when it pushes the pressure up while we are supposedly at rest? And why does it seem to happen so much more frequently as we cross into our later decades? Sanjay Gupta. The conversation is one of survival, even if it feels like it is hurting us, because the aging nervous system is like a seasoned veteran that has seen too many battles and is now prone to overreacting to the smallest rustle in the bushes. When Margaret sat in my office in San Diego, she was clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white, and she didn't even realize she was doing it, which is the perfect metaphor for how we carry tension as we age. Her body was stuck in a feedback loop where a small, natural fluctuation in pressure would cause her to worry, which caused her to tense her muscles, which then sent a signal back to her brain that she was in danger, causing the pressure to spike even further. I explained to her that as we get older, our blood vessels lose some of that youthful elasticity, so they can't absorb the shocks of stress as easily as they once did, making the communication between our brain and our arteries much more loud and chaotic. It's not that the body is failing, it's that it's shouting because it thinks it's protecting you from a threat that doesn't exist, and our job is to provide the hush that allows the system to settle back into its natural rhythm. Margaret eventually learned that her blood pressure wasn't a static number, but a living, breathing reflection of her internal state. And by addressing the physical tightness she didn't even know she had, she was able to stop the cycle of fear that was keeping her numbers in the red. Jane Pauley. So, if the body is shouting, and we are the ones who need to provide that hush you mentioned, it suggests that we have a level of agency that most of us have never been told about in a standard doctor's office. It shifts the perspective from being a passive recipient of a diagnosis to being an active participant in a daily dialogue with our own circulation and nerves. If Margaret's hands were the physical manifestation of her internal alarm system, does that mean the path back to stability is found not in more aggressive intervention, but in these almost invisible physical adjustments that we can perform ourselves? Sanjay Gupta. Exactly, Jane. It is about reclaiming that sense of control that aging often steals away from us. Because when you realize that a simple change in how you hold your hands can quiet a racing heart, the fear starts to evaporate. With Margaret, we didn't start with more pills. We started with her awareness of her own grip and the realization that she was unknowingly keeping her blood vessels in a state of constriction. I watched her transformation from a woman who felt like a victim of her San Diego lifestyle to someone who understood that she held the literal keys to her own tranquility in her palms. We have to understand that the heart is the drummer of the body, but the nervous system is the conductor, and even at 79 or 83, you can still teach the conductor a new, more peaceful score to follow. Jane Pauley. Sanjay, I'm struck by this idea that for decades, our entire medical focus has been centered on the heart as the beginning and the end of the blood pressure story, almost like we've been looking at a house and only ever checking the furnace while ignoring the pipes and the thermostat. It seems almost revolutionary to suggest to someone who has been on blood pressure medication for 20 years that their hands, these things they use to garden, to hold their grandchildren, or to flip through a book, could actually be a primary regulator of their internal pressure. How did we miss this connection for so long? And what is the specific biological magic that happens between our fingertips and our arterial walls that allows the hands to act as such a potent remote control for the entire cardiovascular system? Sanjay Gupta. It's a fascinating oversight in Western medicine, Jane, but if you look at the research coming out of places like the Japanese Society of Hypertension, they have been studying this peripheral connection with incredible intensity. You see, the hands are unique because they have an incredibly high concentration of what we call arteriovenous anastomoses, which are basically direct shunts between small arteries and veins that play a massive role in regulating both temperature and pressure. When we look at the heart, we are looking at the pump, but the hands represent one of the most significant pressure release valves in the entire human body. When your hands are cold, or more importantly, when they are clenched and tense, those valves are slammed shut, forcing the heart to push blood against a much higher resistance, which we see as a rise in blood pressure. Most people over 60 have spent a lifetime developing a clench reflex to stress, and because the hands are so far from the heart, we mistakenly think they are disconnected from the problem, when in reality, they are often the ones sending the SOS signal that keeps the heart in a state of emergency. Jane Pauley. That image of the hands as a pressure release valve is so vivid, and it makes me wonder about all the times we sit in a doctor's waiting room, clutching our arms or gripping our phones, effectively slamming those valves shut right before our pressure is measured. It's as if we are unknowingly sabotaging ourselves because we've never been taught that the state of our extremities dictates the state of our core. Can you walk us through the actual neurological path that a signal takes from a tense hand up to the brain, and how that translates into the constriction of blood vessels that leads to those dangerous spikes we are all so afraid of? Sanjay Gupta. It's a fascinating journey that happens in milliseconds, Jane, because the moment you tighten your grip, sensory receptors in your palms and tendons fire a message straight to the medulla oblongata in your brainstem, which is the command center for your autonomic nervous system. The brain interprets that physical tightness as a sign that you are either preparing for a physical struggle or that you are in a state of high anxiety, and its immediate response is to dump norepinephrine into your system, which tells your blood vessels to tighten up to protect your organs. For a 75-year-old, this reaction is often sticky, meaning once it's turned on, it doesn't turn off as easily as it did when they were 20, leading to that sustained high pressure we see so often. This is why the Japanese researchers found that by simply warming the hands, or using very specific gentle movements to release that tension, you can reverse the signal. You send a message of safety to the brain, which then allows the vessels to dilate and the pressure to drop almost instantly. It's not magic, it's just utilizing the body's own wiring to override a system that has become too sensitive with age. Jane Pauley. It sounds like we are talking about a form of body literacy that we've lost, where we've become so detached from our physical selves that we don't even feel the clench anymore until it shows up as a scary number on a screen. If the brain is constantly monitoring our hands for signs of danger, then it stands to reason that we could spend our whole day in a state of physiological alarm just because of how we hold ourselves while doing the most mundane tasks. Does this mean that for many seniors, their high blood pressure isn't actually a disease of the heart, but rather a chronic state of miscommunication between their hands and their brain? Sanjay Gupta, that is exactly how I've come to view it, Jane, and it changes everything about how we approach treatment for the aging population. Instead of just trying to force the heart to slow down with chemicals, we can start by calming the signals that are making it race in the first place. I often tell my patients that their hands are like the whiskers of a cat. They are constantly sensing the environment and reporting back to the brain. And if those whiskers are always detecting tension, the brain will always be in a state of high alert. By learning to soften the hands, we aren't just relaxing a muscle. We are actually rewriting the neurological script that governs our blood pressure, providing a level of natural stability that no pill can perfectly replicate. Jane Pauley. Sanjay, I want to talk about the things we do when we think nobody is watching, or even when we think we are relaxing, because I suspect that many of our most dangerous habits are the ones that have become completely invisible to us. I see it all the time, people sitting on their porches or in front of the television, seemingly at rest. But if you look closely, their toes are curled, their jaws are set, and their hands are balled into tight little fists as they watch the news or worry about their finances. It's this vocal tension of the body that speaks so much louder than our conscious thoughts. And I wonder how much of the chronic hypertension we see in the elderly is actually being fueled by these tiny, repetitive, unconscious acts of physical aggression against our own systems. How do we begin to identify these phantom habits that are pushing our numbers up every single day without us even realizing we are doing it. Sanjay Gupta. This brings to mind the story of Robert Jenkins, a 68-year-old man from Phoenix, Arizona, who was a retired engineer and a very disciplined person. Robert came to see me because his afternoon blood pressure was consistently hitting 170, even though his morning readings were perfect and his diet was impeccable. When I asked him what he did in the afternoons, he said he just relaxed and watched the news, but when I had him show me how he sat in his chair, I saw the problem immediately. Robert had a habit of gripping the armrests of his recliner so hard that his forearms were actually bulging, and when I pointed it out, he was genuinely shocked. He had no idea he was doing it. He thought he was relaxing, but his body was in a state of isometric contraction for 2 hours every day, which was essentially like he was trying to lift a heavy weight while sitting still, and his heart was responding to that phantom exertion by jacking up his blood pressure to dangerous levels. Jane Pauley, it's incredible that Robert had no idea he was essentially performing a high-intensity workout while trying to watch the news. And it makes me wonder how many of us are gripping our lives in the same way, whether it's holding the steering wheel too tight, clenching our hands while we walk, or even just the way we hold a fork. These tiny moments of tension must add up to a massive cumulative load on the heart over months and years. For someone like Robert in Phoenix, who felt he was doing everything right, how do you explain the danger of this invisible exertion? And why is it so much more damaging for a 68-year-old than it might be for someone in their 30s? Sanjay Gupta. The danger lies in what we call peripheral resistance, and for someone like Robert, that resistance was being created by his own muscles. When you clench your hands or any muscle group for a long period, you are literally squeezing the small blood vessels shut, making it much harder for the heart to circulate blood. In a younger person, the vessels are flexible enough to compensate, but in a 68-year-old, the system is less forgiving. That extra work for the heart quickly translates into a sharp rise in pressure. I told Robert that every time he gripped that chair, he was sending a false signal to his brain that he was in a life or death struggle, and his heart, being a loyal soldier, was simply trying to keep up. This kind of silent stress is devastating because it's constant and unrecognized, and because we don't feel stressed in our minds, we don't think to address the physical tension that is actually doing the damage to our arteries. Jane Pauley. It seems like a cruel irony that the very activities we choose for relaxation could be the ones where we are most physically guarded and tense. If Robert's afternoon spikes were caused by his relaxing chair time, it suggests that we need to perform a kind of body audit several times a day to catch these habits before they become ingrained. How can someone at home who might be sitting in their own version of Robert's chair right now begin to listen to the tension in their hands and feet? And what is the first step in breaking a habit that has been operating in the dark for perhaps decades? Sanjay Gupta. The first step is what I call the scan of the extremities, and I had Robert do this every 30 minutes. You simply stop and ask yourself, where are my thumbs? Are they tucked in or are they soft? Are my toes trying to grip the floor? For Robert, the simple act of placing his palms face up on his lap changed everything, because it is physiologically very difficult to maintain a high state of tension with open, upward-facing palms. It breaks that neurological circuit of fight or flight. When Robert stopped fighting his armchair in Phoenix, his afternoon blood pressure dropped by 20 points within a week without a single change to his medication. It was a revelation for him that his rest wasn't actually restful until he taught his body how to truly let go of the grip it had on itself. Jane Pauley. Sanjay, we've talked about the tension and the hidden habits that drive our pressure up, but I want to turn now to the how, the actual technique that can change everything in a matter of seconds. There is something almost miraculous about the idea that a 20-second action could have a lasting impact on how we feel for the rest of the evening, especially for those who feel like they are tethered to their blood pressure monitors. We often think that health improvements require months of grueling effort, but you are suggesting that the body is actually waiting for a very specific, very brief signal to reset itself. Can you describe the science behind this 20-second shift and why this specific duration seems to be the tipping point for the nervous system to move from a state of alarm to one of deep physiological peace? Sanjay Gupta, it really is a tipping point, Jane, and the research back in 2020 really highlighted how quickly the vascular system can respond when given the right stimulus. The reason 20 seconds is so critical is that it is just long enough for the brain to register a consistent change in peripheral nerve input and decide to adjust its chemical output. When we use the hands to trigger this reset, we are engaging a process where the body releases nitric oxide, which is a powerful natural vasodilator that tells the smooth muscles in your arteries to relax. I've seen patients who were skeptical, thinking that something so short couldn't possibly work, but when they see their systolic number drop by 8 or 12 points right after a session, they realize that the body is actually incredibly responsive if you know how to talk to it. This isn't about a workout, it's about a neurological handshake that tells your heart it's okay to slow down. Jane Pauley, a neurological handshake, that is such a beautiful way to put it. And it makes the process feel so much more intimate and less clinical. For the many people listening who are tired of the side effects of medications, the dizziness, the fatigue, the constant feeling of being over-medicated, this offers a glimmer of hope for a more natural, self-directed form of regulation. Could you explain how this technique, even in its brevity, compares to the way traditional medications work on the blood vessels and why this internal pharmacy of the body might actually be more precise than a pill that has to travel through the entire digestive system? Sanjay Gupta. The difference is precision and timing, Jane. A pill is a blunt instrument. It goes everywhere and stays in your system for hours, often lowering your pressure even when it doesn't need to be lowered, which is why people feel so tired. But when you use this 20-second technique, you are calling upon the body's own just-in-time delivery system for relaxation. It's like the difference between flooding a whole field with water versus using a precision drip system for one thirsty plant. By focusing on the hands and triggering that nitric oxide release, you are lowering the resistance in the pipes exactly when the pressure is high without the hangover effect of synthetic drugs. In my experience, especially with older patients, this builds a sense of confidence that is often missing in modern medicine. They realize they aren't broken, they just needed to learn how to access their own internal medicine cabinet. Jane Pauley. It really shifts the power dynamic, doesn't it? From being a person who is managed by a doctor to being a person who manages their own state. I imagine for someone who has felt at the mercy of their health, this 20-second practice becomes a kind of ritual of reclaimed power. Is there a specific way that people should breathe or focus their minds during these 20 seconds to maximize the effect? Or is the physical action itself enough to carry the message to the brain regardless of what they are thinking? Sanjay Gupta. While the physical action is the primary driver, adding a soft, rhythmic breath definitely amplifies the signal because it adds another layer of safety data for the brain to process. I tell my patients to imagine that as they soften their hands, they are literally pouring the tension out of their fingertips into the air. It's about creating a lullaby for the nervous system. When the brain receives the signal of soft hands and a slow breath simultaneously, it has no choice but to dial back the blood pressure. It is a biological imperative. Seeing a patient realize that they can calm their own heart in less time than it takes to tie a shoe is one of the most rewarding things I witness as a doctor, because it's the moment they stop being afraid of their own body. Jane Pauley. Sanjay, I want to talk about the early warning signs that so many of us simply dismiss as just getting older. We wake up with a bit of stiffness, our hands feel a little cold even when it's warm out, or maybe we feel a slight heaviness in our shoulders as the day goes on, and we just shrug it off as a natural part of the aging process. But I suspect these aren't just random aches and pains. They are actually the body's way of whispering that the pressure is building long before we ever feel sick or see a high number on the cuff. For someone who has spent their life ignoring their own physical discomfort in favor of staying busy, how do we train ourselves to recognize these subtle distress calls from our extremities? And why is the temperature of our hands such a critical indicator of what our heart is going through? Sanjay Gupta, you are absolutely right, Jane. These are the quiet alarms that we've been trained to ignore, and they are exactly what I saw in Eleanor Brooks, a 79-year-old woman from Portland, Oregon. Eleanor was a retired librarian, very sharp, but she started noticing that her hands were perpetually icy and her shoulders felt like they were being pushed down by invisible weights every evening. She thought it was just the Portland dampness or a bit of arthritis, but what was actually happening was that her peripheral blood vessels were in a state of chronic constriction. Her body was literally pulling in the blood to protect her core, which was driving her blood pressure into the 180s. She was also experiencing these lightheaded moments that she dismissed as just getting up too fast, but they were actually her heart struggling to maintain a steady flow against all that resistance. Jane Pauley. It's so easy to see how Eleanor could have missed those signs, especially in a place like Portland where you expect to be a little cold and stiff. But that connection between cold hands and high blood pressure seems so counterintuitive to most people. We usually think of high pressure as being hot or flushed. Can you explain the physiological paradox of why a cold extremity often means a dangerously high internal pressure, and what Eleanor's body was actually trying to achieve by shutting down the circulation to her fingers and toes? Sanjay Gupta, it is a paradox of survival, Jane. When the brain perceives stress or a lack of internal balance, it activates the sympathetic nervous system, which causes vasoconstriction in the extremities. It's the body's way of hoarding blood for the vital organs, like it's preparing for a siege. But in doing so, it creates a massive bottleneck in the system. Imagine a 4-lane highway suddenly narrowing down to 1 lane. The pressure behind that bottleneck is going to skyrocket. That was Eleanor's reality. Her cold hands weren't the problem. They were the symptom of a heart that was being forced to work twice as hard to push blood through narrowed vessels. I told her that her icy fingers were her body's way of screaming help because the system was under too much strain, and by ignoring that coldness, she was allowing her blood pressure to climb higher and higher every night. Jane Pauley. So for Eleanor, her lightheadedness and her heavy shoulders were actually the final stages of a message that had started in her hands hours earlier. It makes me wonder how many people are walking around right now feeling heavy or cold and reaching for a sweater when they should really be reaching for a way to relax their vascular system. If someone notices their hands are cold in the middle of a stressful afternoon, is that the golden moment where they can intervene and prevent a major spike later that evening? Sanjay Gupta, precisely, Jane. That is the window of opportunity. I taught Eleanor that the moment she felt that chill in her fingertips, she needed to stop whatever she was doing and use the hand warming and relaxation techniques we discussed. By consciously bringing warmth and softness back to her hands, she was essentially telling her brain to open up those highway lanes again. Once the blood started flowing back to her extremities, the bottleneck disappeared and her heart could finally relax. Eleanor was amazed to find that as her hands warmed up, that heavy weight on her shoulders lifted almost instantly, and her dizzy spells vanished. She realized that her body wasn't failing her. It was just trying to manage a crisis the only way it knew how. And she finally had the tools to help it find its way back to balance. Jane Pauley. Sanjay, I want to dive into a very common misunderstanding about how we fix things as we get older, because I think many of us have this deep-seated belief that if something is wrong, we need to apply more effort, more force, and more grit to overcome it. We see this in the way people approach health. They think they need to squeeze their hands harder to exercise them, or they need to exert more willpower to control their numbers. But you are suggesting something quite the opposite, that the harder we try, in a physical sense, especially with our hands, the more we might be inadvertently triggering the very stress response we are trying to avoid. Why is the concept of effort so dangerous when it comes to blood pressure? And how does the simple act of trying too hard physically shut down the production of the very chemicals that our body needs to stay relaxed? Sanjay Gupta. This is one of the most important points we can cover, Jane, because the no pain, no gain mentality is absolutely toxic for a 60 or 70-year-old struggling with hypertension. When you use force, when you squeeze or siat chat your hands thinking you are doing something good, you are actually triggering a mechanical reflex that tells the brain there is a physical threat. This physical exertion immediately inhibits the release of nitric oxide, the very miracle molecule we need to dilate our vessels. I see so many seniors using those old-fashioned hand grippers or squeezing tennis balls with all their might, thinking they are improving their circulation. But for someone with high blood pressure, they are often doing the exact opposite. They are creating a massive spike in pressure because the heart has to fight against that intense forced contraction. Jane Pauley. It's such a powerful shift in mindset to move from squeezing to softening, and I imagine it's quite difficult for a generation that was raised on the idea that hard work is the answer to every problem. We've been taught that if we want results, we have to grab them, but here you are saying we have to release them. Can you explain the science of how gentleness, the almost weightless touch, actually stimulates the nervous system more effectively than brute force? And what happens at the cellular level when we choose a soft approach over a hard one? Sanjay Gupta. It's all about the receptors, Jane. Our hands have these incredibly sensitive nerve endings called Meissner's corpuscles that respond to light touch and gentle pressure. When we use a soft, flowing movement, we are talking directly to these receptors, which send a calm signal to the brain, whereas heavy pressure bypasses them and goes straight to the danger receptors in the deeper tissue. When the brain receives that soft signal, it triggers the endothelial cells lining your blood vessels to start pumping out nitric oxide. This gas then seeps into the surrounding muscle tissue and tells it to relax, causing the vessels to expand like a flower opening in the sun. If you squeeze hard, you literally crush those delicate pathways and stop the flow of that healing gas. It's the ultimate lesson in less is more.
Then Jane Pauley. So, for the person at home who thinks they need to work on their blood pressure, the work is actually in learning how to do nothing with more intention. It's almost a form of meditation through the fingertips. I can imagine someone feeling a bit skeptical that being gentle could be as effective as a powerful drug. But it sounds like we are talking about a very specific biological trigger that only responds to a soft key. Does this mean that even our self-care routines could be making us sicker if we are approaching them with too much intensity or tension? Sanjay Gupta, absolutely, and I've seen it time and again. If you are trying to relax, but your jaw is tight and your hands are clenched, you aren't relaxing. You are just performing a new kind of stress. I tell my patients to think of their hands as being made of silk rather than stone. When you move with that silken quality, you are inviting your cardiovascular system to mirror that softness. It's a profound realization for many that they don't have to fight their way to health. They can simply ease their way there. By letting go of the need to exert force, you allow your body's natural intelligence to take over, and that is where the real sustainable healing begins. Jane Pauley. Sanjay, I'm thinking about the story of Thomas Miller, whom you've mentioned before, a man in his early 80s who was dealing with some of the most stubborn health challenges we face as we age, including that dreaded morning hypertension and the stiffness that makes every movement feel like a chore. For someone like Thomas, who is 83, it's easy to feel like the big changes are no longer possible and that life is just a slow process of losing ground. But you've said that for him, it wasn't a radical new diet or a grueling exercise plan that changed his life, but rather these tiny, almost insignificant-looking habits that he wove into his daily routine. How does an 83-year-old man from Tampa, Florida, go from feeling stuck in his aging body to finding a new sense of freedom and stability? And why do these small habits have such a disproportionately large impact on someone in their 9th decade of life? Sanjay Gupta. Thomas Miller was a remarkable man, Jane, but when he first came to me in Tampa, he was exhausted. He was waking up every morning with a blood pressure of 190, and his hands were so stiff he could barely hold his coffee mug. He felt like his world was shrinking. I told Thomas that we weren't going to try to turn back the clock 40 years. We were just going to change what he did during the first 4 minutes of his day. We implemented a very simple routine where, before he even got out of bed, he would spend just 60 seconds on each hand using the gentle softening and switch-off techniques we've discussed. He did it again in the afternoon while sitting on his porch, and once more before sleep. It sounded too small to him at first. He's an old-school guy who believed in big solutions, but within 2 weeks, his morning readings dropped to 145, and his sleep became deeper and more restorative than it had been in years. Jane Pauley. It's almost hard to believe that 4 minutes a day could be the difference between a crisis and a stable life for an 83-year-old. But it speaks to this idea that the older we get, the more leverage we have with small changes because our systems are so sensitive. For Thomas, it wasn't just about the numbers on the screen. It was about how he felt when he woke up. Can you explain why that morning spike is so dangerous for seniors and how Thomas's tiny habit was able to intercept that dangerous surge before it could do damage to his heart or brain?
Sanjay Gupta. The morning surge is the most dangerous time for a heart attack or stroke because it's when the body is transitioning from the stillness of sleep to the demands of the day, and the nervous system often overshoots the mark. For Thomas, his body was waking up with a massive jolt of adrenaline that his stiff arteries couldn't handle. By doing his hand routine before he even stood up, he was manually pre-calibrating his nervous system. He was sending a message of calm to his brain before the morning stress could take hold. It was like warming up a car engine on a cold Florida morning instead of just flooring the gas. That small habit provided a buffer that allowed his pressure to rise gently and naturally instead of spiking violently, which is exactly what saved him from the constant fear he was living in. Jane Pauley. It really shows that you are never too old for your body to learn a new rhythm. Thomas's story gives so much hope to those who feel they have passed the point of no return. It's about meeting the body where it is, with kindness instead of frustration. If Thomas could find that kind of relief at 83, it suggests that these small habits are actually the most powerful tools we have as we age. Is there a specific sense of mental quiet that Thomas developed alongside these physical habits that helped him sustain this progress? Sanjay Gupta. Yes, Jane, he started to view his morning routine not as a task, but as a gift to himself. He stopped checking his blood pressure with dread and started checking it with curiosity. That shift from fear to curiosity is the real secret behind the success of these small habits. Thomas realized that he wasn't just managing a disease, he was participating in his own vitality. He told me recently that he feels more in tune with his body now than he did in his 50s because he finally learned to listen to the whispers instead of waiting for the screams. That is the power of a small habit. It doesn't just change your blood pressure, it changes your relationship with your own life. Jane Pauley. Sanjay, we've talked about the what and the how, but I want to focus now on the when, because I suspect that timing is everything when it comes to the body's internal clock. We all have these natural peaks and valleys in our energy and our blood pressure throughout the day, and it seems like there are these golden windows where our system is most receptive to being reset. If we just wait until the pressure is already high to do something, we are always playing catch up. But if we can hit these specific golden moments, we might be able to prevent the spikes from ever happening. Could you guide us through the 3 most critical times of day for a person over 60 to use these hand-based techniques, and why the body's circadian rhythm makes these specific moments so uniquely powerful for self-regulation? Sanjay Gupta, timing is the silent partner in health, Jane, and if you understand your body's rhythm, you can do half the work for twice the result. The first golden window is that transition from sleep to waking, which we saw with Thomas, the pre-dawn moment where your system is preparing for the day. The second is the afternoon slump around 3 or 4 p.m., when the morning's cortisol has worn off and the body often tenses up to power through the rest of the day. This is when Robert in Phoenix would start to grip his chair. And the third, perhaps most important for long-term health, is the pre-sleep window, where you transition from the noise of the world to the silence of rest. If you can use your hands to signal peace at these 3 junctions, you aren't just lowering your pressure for a few minutes, you are literally training your brain to maintain a lower set point all day long. Jane Pauley, that idea of a set point is so interesting. The idea that our body has a default level of tension that we can actually lower over time. It makes it feel less like a temporary fix and more like a true reprogramming of our biology. Why does the pre-sleep window have such a lasting impact on the following day's blood pressure? And what is the specific connection between the tension in our hands at night and the quality of the deep repair that our kidneys and heart are supposed to be doing while we sleep? Sanjay Gupta, it's because the body doesn't reset during sleep if it's still in a state of guardedness, Jane. If you go to bed with hard hands and a tight jaw, your sympathetic nervous system stays active all night, preventing your blood pressure from dipping, which is the natural, healthy drop in pressure that should happen during sleep. This non-dipping is a major risk factor for heart issues in seniors. By using the 20-second hand technique before bed, you are essentially giving your system permission to fully power down. This allows the kidneys to filter blood more effectively and the heart to truly rest, meaning you wake up the next morning with a fuller tank and a lower baseline pressure. It's a cumulative effect. The more good nights you have, the more resilient your system becomes during the day. Jane Pauley, so it's a virtuous cycle. The more we use these golden windows, the more automatic the relaxation becomes. It's as if we are building a new, calmer default setting for our older age. For someone who feels like their day is a constant battle with their numbers, this schedule provides a simple 3-point map to follow. Does it take a long time for the body to start remembering these resets, or can someone start to feel that shift in their baseline set point within just a few days of hitting these 3 time slots? Sanjay Gupta, most people start to feel a change in their internal hum within 48 to 72 hours, Jane. It's like tuning a piano. Once you get the strings to the right tension, they stay there for a while before they need to be adjusted again. By hitting those 3 golden moments, you are keeping the strings of your nervous system in perfect tune. I've seen patients who have been on the blood pressure roller coaster for years finally find a steady, calm rhythm just by being consistent with these 3 times of day. It's not about doing more. It's about doing the right thing at the right time and letting the body's natural wisdom do the rest. Jane Pauley, Sanjay, as we come to the end of this journey today, I find myself thinking back to that first image we talked about, the woman sitting in her chair, feeling like her body was a stranger or a traitor because her blood pressure had spiked for no reason.
We've traveled from that place of fear and betrayal to a place of understanding where we see that our hands, our breath, and our timing are all part of a deep, beautiful conversation our body is trying to have with us. It's such a hopeful message for anyone over 60 that your body isn't breaking down. It's just asking to be listened to in a new way. As we wrap up, what is the one thing you want every person who feels betrayed by their health to hold on to when they look at their hands tonight? And how can they begin to transform that fear into a lifelong partnership with their own circulation? Sanjay Gupta. My final message is simple but profound. Your body is always on your side, Jane. Even when the numbers are high, even when you feel stiff or cold. That is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of communication. Your body is doing its absolute best with the signals it's receiving, and today we've learned how to give it better signals. When you look at your hands tonight, don't see them just as aged tools, but as the most sophisticated medical instruments you will ever own. They are your direct line to your heart and your brain. If you approach yourself with the same gentleness we've discussed, moving from the clench of fear to the softness of awareness, you will find that your body is incredibly eager to return to a state of balance. It has been such an honor to share these stories, from Margaret in San Diego to Thomas in Tampa, because they prove that no matter your age, you have the power to hush the noise and find the peace that lives within your own vessels. Thank you so much for having me, Jane, and to everyone listening. Be kind to your hands, and your heart will thank you. Jane Pauley. Sanjay, thank you. You have given us more than just medical advice. You have given us a new way to inhabit our own lives as we age, with more grace and less fear. I hope everyone listening takes a moment right now to just look at their hands and feel that potential for peace. It's been an absolute joy to have this conversation with you, and to our wonderful audience of Healthy Kidneys After 60, thank you for spending this time with us. If this episode touched you, if you found a moment of hush in your own day, please consider subscribing to our podcast and sharing it with a friend who might need to hear this message of hope. We have so many more stories and insights to share in our upcoming episodes, so stay tuned, keep your hands soft, and we will see you next time. Goodbye for now. Sanjay Gupta. Goodbye, everyone. Take care of yourselves, and remember, you are in good hands, your own. It was a pleasure being here.